Hello everyone. We are going to be continuing practicing being historians for global studies. We are still in Unit 1 called Historical Thinking and Geographical Thinking. So this is in an Edpuzzle. And our goal for this lesson is to look at what sources historians use to learn about the past. And as a part of this lesson, we're going to identify examples of primary sources, examples of secondary sources, and we're going to explain the difference between a primary and secondary source. So we're going to revisit the lunchroom fight that we started talking about in the last Edpuzzle lesson. That lesson was called What is History? And we were first introduced to this idea of this cafeteria or lunchroom fight, that two boys had gotten into a fight, and in our last lesson, if you had to step into the shoes of the principal of the school and try to determine what happened and who the sources are or what the sources are for that evidence. In the last lesson, we talked about point of view and the evidence to support someone's point of view. And I'm going to remind you guys, point of view in history is someone's opinion. It's not first person, second person, or third person. That's what we would find in English class. Point of view in history is the opinion of the person or the opinion of the source. So let's get started. We're going to read these two different accounts from these two different sources. So Max here, he is one of the boys that got into a fight. And Max says, "That kid Justin is psycho. He turned around and punched me out of nowhere. Me and my friends were standing in line, just joking around, and he turned around and punched me for no reason. He's messed up and creepy. Ask anyone." Now, Alicia is a girl in the same grade as Max and Justin, and she says, "My friend Malik said he was in the lunchroom when Max and Justin started fighting. He told me that some people moved away to give the boys space, while some others ran to break it up. I don't really know either of them, but I bet Justin started it." So we've got two different sources here. Max, who was involved in the fight, and Alicia, who didn't see the fight, but she heard about it from her friend Malik. So identify one difference between these sources. One big difference is that Max was a part of the fight. I mean, he was involved in it. Alicia did not see the fight at all, and she's going based on what her friend Malik said. That is one big difference here between these two sources. Now, all we're doing is identifying the differences and the similarities here. We're not discussing quite yet reliability, who we believe more than others, or picking apart someone's story. Now, identify one similarity between these sources. One similarity is that they both have a kind of a low opinion of this Justin kid. They're both blaming Justin. I mean, Max is the one that was involved in the fight along with Justin, and he is saying that Justin started it. Alicia is telling us that even though she doesn't know either of them, she would bet that Justin started it. So that's a similarity. All right, moving down here. What sources do historians use to learn about the past? History is an account of the past constructed from evidence. We know this from our last lesson, our last Edpuzzle. This account of the past differs based on the author's point of view. Now up here we can see two different points of view between Max and Alicia. Both of their accounts, or both of their points of view, are evidence. A source is something that historians use to learn about the past. So we are using Max and Alicia's point of view as evidence. They are also a source of what happened in the past. The lunchroom fight or the cafeteria fight is something that happened in the past, and we need to figure out what happened. Historians use two types of sources to gather evidence to write about the past. Now, these are things that we need to know and continue to use throughout this global studies course. Primary source is material from the time period being studied. So, for example, a primary source is the diary of Anne Frank. This is a diary written by a young Jewish girl who hid from the Nazis during the Holocaust. A secondary source is a document created based on primary sources and the work of other authors. So, for example, an essay written in 2016 about the Neolithic Revolution that occurred over 10,000 years ago is a secondary source. So here we get to your task for the Edpuzzle. Based on the definitions above of primary source and secondary source, I'm going to have you identify each of the documents below as either primary or secondary and explain why you identified it as that. Let's get started with our task. What I'm going to have you do is, in the Edpuzzle, it's going to ask you to answer either primary or secondary source for this. A journal entry written by Christopher Columbus describing his voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. Next, I'm going to ask you to answer this by identifying whether this is a primary source or a secondary source. A textbook chapter about World War I from 1914 to 1919, written in 1996. Is this a primary or a secondary source? Two more. A letter written from George Washington to Thomas Jefferson. Is this a primary or a secondary source? And last, a sword that was made in 1317. Is this a primary or a secondary source? All right, to close out this lesson on primary and secondary sources, we've identified two different types of sources used by historians. I'm reading up here. And those two different types of sources are primary and secondary. Now, the last thing I'm going to have you do in the Edpuzzle is going back to Max's account of the fight. Is his account a primary source or a secondary source? And I'm going to ask you to explain why. Then your next item is to tell me whether Alicia's account of what happened is a primary or a secondary source, and explain to me why.